The string quartet, bless their well-intentioned but slightly off-key efforts, was valiantly attempting a rendition of Pachelbel's canon as I stood at the altar, a meticulously tailored tuxedo, feeling suddenly, uncomfortably, like a bespoke straitjacket. My bride-to-be, Olivia, was due to walk down the aisle in precisely 7 minutes. 7 minutes until she became Mrs. Alistair Finch. 7 minutes until our carefully planned and rather extravagantly expensive wedding reached its supposed joyful culmination. My name is Alistair Finch, 42 years old, and for the past 15 years, I have been a senior data analyst specializing in network security and anomaly detection for a major financial institution. My world revolves around identifying patterns, tracing digital footprints, and uncovering hidden, often illicit, connections within vast, complex data sets. Olivia's behavior over the past few weeks, I had belatedly, and with a growing sense of cold dread, begun to realize was a dataset riddled with anomalies, a network exhibiting highly suspicious, unauthorized traffic. The anomaly currently causing the most significant system alert was seated 3 rows back on Olivia's side of the elegantly decorated chapel, a man named Julian Vance. Julian, according to Olivia, was an old university friend, someone she'd lost touch with but recently reconnected with purely platonically, and whose presence at our wedding was merely a gesture of nostalgic affection. My own data, however, meticulously gathered over the past 72 rather sleepless hours, suggested a rather different and far less platonic connection. I adjusted my silk bow tie, my gaze sweeping over the assembled guests, a sea of expectant faces, carefully chosen outfits, and the faint, cloying scent of too many floral arrangements. My best man, my old university friend, Thomas, caught my eye and gave me a small, encouraging nod. He knew. I'd confided in him late last night, after the final, damning piece of evidence had clicked into place. His reaction had been a mixture of stunned disbelief and a quiet, simmering fury on my behalf. "Alistair," he'd said, his voice grim. "Are you absolutely certain? This is catastrophic." "The data, Thomas," I'd replied, my own voice a monotone I barely recognized, "is irrefutable. The anomalies are statistically significant. The probability of an innocent explanation is negligible." The anomalies had begun subtly, small deviations from Olivia's usual patterns of behavior. The hush phone call she'd taken in another room, her phone suddenly and uncharacteristically password protected. The late nights working on wedding preparations that seemed to involve an inordinate amount of time away from home, with vague, evasive explanations. The new, expensive lingerie I'd accidentally discovered tucked away in a drawer. Lingerie far more adventurous than anything she had ever worn for me. And then there was Julian. His name had started cropping up in Olivia's conversation about a month ago, always casually, always framed as a chance encounter, a rekindled platonic friendship. Yet, there was a certain intensity in her voice when she spoke of him, a brightness in her eyes that I hadn't seen directed at me in a very long time. My professional instincts, honed by years of detecting subtle, almost invisible network intrusions, had begun to prickle. I hadn't wanted to believe it. Olivia, my beautiful, vivacious, and supposedly devoted fiancée, the woman I was about to pledge my life to, involved in something else? It seemed unthinkable. But an analyst, a good analyst, never ignores the data, however unwelcome its implications. And so, with a heavy heart and a growing sense of cold foreboding, I had begun my own quiet, discreet investigation. It hadn't been difficult. Olivia, for all her intelligence, was surprisingly careless with her digital security, a common vulnerability I often encountered in my professional life. Her personal laptop, the one she used for her wedding planning and her increasingly frequent catch-up chats with Julian, was protected by a password that was embarrassingly easy to guess: her cat's name and her birth year. Inside that laptop, within her supposedly secure messaging apps, I had found the truth. A truth far uglier, far more devastating than I could have ever imagined. A truth that was currently sitting 3 rows back, looking smug and expectant, waiting for the ceremony to begin, waiting for Olivia to become my wife, while still, apparently, remaining very much his. The string quartet was now transitioning, with a rather jarring key change, into the opening bars of the bridal chorus. The heavy oak doors at the back of the chapel creaked open. A collective sigh of anticipation rippled through the guests. My 7 minutes were up. Olivia, my beautiful, duplicitous Olivia, was about to make her entrance. And I, Alistair Finch, senior data analyst, expert in anomaly detection, was about to execute a system override that would bring this entire fraudulent network crashing down spectacularly and irretrievably. The wedding surprise I'd planned for her, and for Julian, was not a romantic honeymoon or a piece of expensive jewelry. It was a meticulously compiled, irrefutably documented, and very public exposure of their deceit. The processional music swelled. All heads turned, and I, standing at the altar, felt not the joyful anticipation of a groom, but the cold, focused resolve of a man about to present his final, damning, and entirely unassailable audit report. This wedding, I vowed, would indeed be one for the historical record, though not, perhaps, in the way Olivia or Julian had envisioned. The decision to confront Olivia and Julian so publicly at our own wedding had not been made lightly. It was a strategy born of a cold, calculated fury and a profound, almost unbearable sense of betrayal. My initial discovery of their affair, stumbled upon 3 days prior through Olivia's carelessly secured laptop, had felt like a physical blow, knocking the air from my lungs, leaving me reeling in a state of stunned, nauseous disbelief. Olivia, the woman I had loved, the woman I had been planning to spend the rest of my life with, had been systematically deceiving me, not just with a casual fling, but with a sustained, apparently deeply emotional, and certainly physically intimate relationship with this old university friend, Julian Vance. The messages I had found were not the underscore brief, furtive exchanges of a clandestine affair. They were a chronicle of a parallel life, filled with shared jokes, intimate confessions, plans for future trysts, and, most damningly, a series of increasingly explicit discussions about our wedding, my finances, and how they might navigate the unfortunate complication of my continued existence in Olivia's life post-nuptials. Julian, it seemed, was not just an old flame rekindled. He was an active co-conspirator in a plan that extended far beyond mere infidelity. There were references to Alistair's portfolio, to the prenup I made her sign, a standard, sensible document protecting my premarital assets, which Olivia had feigned indifference to at the time, but had clearly discussed in detail with Julian, and even, chillingly, to the inevitable, if regrettable, period of marital adjustment before Olivia could fully transition to her life with him, presumably with a significant portion of my assets in tow. My initial reaction had been a maelstrom of emotions: shock, grief, a searing, white-hot anger. I had wanted to confront her immediately, to unleash the torrent of pain and betrayal that was consuming me. But then, the analyst, the strategist, the part of me honed by years of dissecting complex deceptions, had taken over. A premature confrontation, without a clear plan, without irrefutable, publicly presentable evidence, would achieve nothing but a messy, inconclusive he said, she said. Olivia was a skilled manipulator, adept at twisting narratives, at playing the victim. She would deny, she would gaslight, she would try to turn the tables, to paint me as the jealous, possessive, perhaps even delusional fiancé. No, this required a different approach. This required a forensic deconstruction of their deceit, presented in a forum where denial would be impossible, where the full weight of their treachery would be exposed not just to me, but to everyone whose good opinion they clearly valued. Our wedding, with its carefully curated guest list of family, friends, and influential business associates, many of them mine, a fact Olivia had often lamented, seemed the perfect, if brutally ironic, venue. For the next 72 hours, I had worked with a cold, focused intensity a man possessed. Sleep was a forgotten luxury. Food, an irrelevant distraction. My mind, usually occupied with analyzing network vulnerabilities and tracing illicit data flows, was now entirely consumed with building an unassailable case against my fiancée and her lover. I meticulously copied every incriminating message, every suggestive email, every damning financial reference from Olivia's laptop, archiving them onto a secure, encrypted drive. I cross-referenced their communications with Olivia's calendar, with her credit card statements, which, as her fiancé and cohabitant, I had legitimate, if rarely exercised, access to, creating a detailed timeline of their affair, a map of their deceit. The expensive lingerie, I discovered, had been a gift from Julian. The late nights, wedding planning, had often coincided with reservations at discreet boutique hotels. The rekindled platonic friendship was, in fact, a torrid, long-standing affair that had likely begun months, perhaps even years, before Julian's name had ever crossed Olivia's lips in my presence. I also did a deep dive into Julian Vance himself. He was, as Olivia had claimed, an old university acquaintance, but his subsequent career path had been less than stellar. A string of failed business ventures, a reputation for charming his way into and then out of other people's money, a series of relationships with financially comfortable and often emotionally vulnerable women. He was, in essence, a professional predator, a grifter with a plausible veneer of sophistication. And Olivia, with her own ambitions for a lifestyle perhaps beyond her independent means, and her access to my not inconsiderable wealth, had clearly become his latest and potentially most lucrative project. The prenuptial agreement, the one I had insisted upon not out of mistrust, but out of a sensible desire to protect the assets I had worked a lifetime to accumulate, now seemed like a particularly galling target for them. Their messages were filled with discussions about how to navigate its clauses, how to ensure Olivia's future security, a clear euphemism for her ability to extract a maximum settlement from me, and even, disturbingly, how to potentially challenge its validity post-marriage by claiming duress or lack of full disclosure on my part. They were not just planning an affair. They were planning a systematic financial fleecing. My best man, Thomas, had been my only confidant in this grim undertaking. When I had finally laid out the evidence for him, less than 24 hours before the wedding, his reaction had been one of stunned disbelief, quickly followed by a righteous fury that mirrored my own. He had offered to confront Daniel, his own name, ironically enough, shared by Olivia's other man in this sordid drama, to have a quiet word with Julian to call the whole wedding off discreetly. But I had been adamant. "No, Thomas," I'd said, "this needs to be public. They have chosen to play this game in the shadows, to weave their lies into the very fabric of our lives, of this wedding. The exposure needs to be equally comprehensive. They need to understand, and everyone they care about needs to understand, the true nature of their character, the full extent of their deceit." Thomas, though clearly uncomfortable with the prospect of such a public denouement, had eventually, reluctantly, agreed to support my plan. He understood, as a fellow analyst, he was a brilliant astrophysicist, the cold, satisfying logic of presenting irrefutable data. And so, as Olivia, radiant in her ridiculously expensive designer gown, her face a mask of bridal innocence, began her slow, deliberate walk down the aisle towards me, towards the future she believed she had so cleverly secured, I felt not a flicker of my former love, not a trace of regret. Only a cold, hard, and entirely focused resolve. The data packets of their lies had been intercepted, decrypted, and analyzed. The anomaly had been identified, and the system override, the one that would expose their entire fraudulent network, was about to be executed, live, and in front of a capacity audience. The string quartet swelled to a crescendo. Olivia reached the altar, her eyes, when they met mine, shining with a carefully rehearsed adoration. She offered me her hand. I took it. It was cold. The anomaly detection system, I thought with a grim internal satisfaction, was functioning perfectly. The wedding was about to begin, and so was the reckoning. The presiding clergyman, a portly, well-meaning man named Reverend Albright, whose primary acquaintance with our relationship seemed to be the rather generous donation Olivia had insisted we make to his church's roof repair fund, beamed at us with avuncular approval. "Dearly beloved," he began, his voice resonating through the hushed chapel, "we are gathered here today, in the sight of God and this congregation, to join together this man, Alistair, and this woman, Olivia, in holy matrimony." I let his familiar, soothing words wash over me, a conventional soundtrack to an increasingly unconventional situation. My gaze, however, was not on the Reverend, nor on Olivia's artfully arranged bridal veil. It was fixed on Julian Vance, seated 3 rows back, his expression a carefully constructed mask of polite, friendly interest, though I thought I detected a faint, almost imperceptible smirk playing on his lips. He caught my eye for a fraction of a second, a flicker of something, triumph, complicity, in his gaze before he looked away. He clearly believed he was an unseen observer, a silent partner in Olivia's impending victory. He had no idea he was about to become a featured player in a rather different kind of ceremony. The Reverend droned on, through the usual exhortations about love, fidelity, and the sanctity of the marital bond. Olivia, beside me, occasionally dabbed at her eyes with a delicate lace handkerchief, a performance of bridal emotion that, given what I now knew, was almost breathtaking in its audacity. I wondered, with a detached, analytical curiosity, if she had rehearsed these tears, these trembles, these carefully timed glances of adoration towards me, with Julian. Had they critiqued her performance, offered suggestions for improvement? The thought was as ludicrous as it was repellent. Finally, the moment arrived. "Do you, Alistair James Finch," Reverend Albright intoned, his gaze fixed on me, "take this woman, Olivia Catherine Hayes, to be your lawfully wedded wife, to live together in the holy estate of matrimony? Will you love her, comfort her, honor and keep her, in sickness and in health, and forsaking all others, keep thee only unto her, so long as you both shall live?" The traditional words, the solemn vows, hung in the air, a stark, ironic counterpoint to the swordsville reality of Olivia's deceit. The entire congregation leaned forward, expectant. This was it. My cue. I took a slow, deliberate breath. "Reverend Albright," I began, my voice clear and steady, carrying easily through the suddenly very silent chapel. "Before I answer that rather significant question, there's a small matter of network security that I feel compelled to address. A rather egregious breach, in fact, that has recently come to my attention, one that directly impacts the integrity of this proposed merger." A confused murmur rippled through the guests. Olivia's head snapped towards me, her eyes wide with a sudden, dawning alarm. Julian Vance, I noted from the corner of my eye, had gone very, very still. Reverend Albright blinked, his benign smile faltering. I beg your pardon, Alistair? Network security? Indeed, Reverend," I continued, my gaze now fixed on Olivia, then shifting deliberately to meet the suddenly panicked eyes of Julian Vance. "It seems that the primary network of this union, the one supposedly built on trust, fidelity, and mutual respect, has been compromised, infiltrated, in fact, by a rather persistent piece of malware, a Trojan horse, if you will, that has been systematically corrupting data, diverting resources, and generally undermining the entire operational integrity of the system." Olivia's face had gone deathly pale. Her hand, the one not clutching her bouquet of virginal white roses, flew to her throat. "Alistair, what are you saying?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I am saying, Olivia," I replied, my voice still calm, but now imbued with an unmistakable edge of cold, hard anger, "that your protestations of love, your vows of fidelity, your entire performance as the blushing, devoted bride, are a meticulously crafted lie. A lie designed to secure access to my assets, to facilitate a rather opportunistic acquisition with the full, and I must say, rather enthusiastic complicity of your old university friend, Mr. Julian Vance, who I see is gracing us with his presence today. I gestured, almost casually, toward the third row. All heads, as if on a collective string, swiveled in Julian's direction. He looked like a man who had just been publicly identified as a carrier of a rare and highly contagious disease. His face was ashen, his earlier smirk replaced by a look of stark, unadulterated terror. He half rose from his seat, as if to flee, then seemed to think better of it, sinking back down, a trapped animal. "You see, ladies and gentlemen," I said, my voice resonating with the authority of a prosecutor presenting irrefutable evidence. While Olivia and I were supposedly planning our idyllic future together, she and Mr. Vance were, in fact, engaged in a rather different kind of planning. A plan to systematically defraud me. A plan to ensure that Olivia's transition from my fiancée to my ex-wife would be as financially lucrative for them, and as devastating for me, as possible. I then reached into the inside pocket of my tuxedo, not for a ring, but for a slim, silver USB drive. The same drive onto which I had meticulously copied every incriminating message, every damning financial projection, every sordid detail of their conspiracy. "This small device," I announced, holding it aloft for all to see, "contains the complete, unexpurgated, and rather colorful correspondence between Olivia and Mr. Vance for the past 18 months. It details their affair, their plans to contest our prenuptial agreement, their strategies for maximizing Olivia's settlement, and their rather optimistic projections for their shared future, a future to be built, it seems, largely upon the ruins of mine." The silence in the chapel was now so profound, so absolute, that I could hear the faint, almost imperceptible whir of the air conditioning system. Olivia was openly weeping, not the delicate, bridal tears of earlier, but harsh, racking sobs of humiliation and despair. Julian Vance looked as though he might actually vomit. Reverend Albright, his face a mask of horrified disbelief, seemed to have been struck dumb. "So, Reverend," I concluded, turning back to the stunned clergyman, my voice now imbued with a quiet, almost weary finality. "To answer your question, no. I do not take this woman, Olivia Catherine Hayes, to be my lawfully wedded wife. For the vows she was about to make, like the love she professed, are, according to the irrefutable data, a carefully constructed and entirely fraudulent fabrication. The network has been breached. The system is compromised. And this particular merger, I'm afraid, is hereby, and with extreme prejudice, terminated." I then placed the USB drive on the altar, a small, silver offering to the god of unintended consequences. "The full audit report, Reverend," I said, "is now yours to peruse. Perhaps it will provide some illuminating sermon material for future congregations contemplating the sanctity of the marital contract." And with that, I turned on my heel, leaving behind a scene of shattered illusions, public humiliation, and the rather spectacular, real-time implosion of a wedding that had been built, from its very inception, on a foundation of lies. My best man, Thomas, was already at my side, his hand on my shoulder, his expression a mixture of grim satisfaction and profound relief. "Well, Alistair," he murmured, as we walked briskly down the aisle, past rows of stunned, silent guests. "For a data analyst, you certainly know how to execute a system crash with theatrical flair." I didn't reply. I just kept walking out of the chapel, out of that fraudulent farce of a wedding, and into the clear, clean air of a future that was at last entirely and unapologetically my own. The anomaly had not just been detected. It had been decisively, and very publicly, neutralized. The immediate aftermath of my rather unconventional wedding ceremony was, as Thomas had so aptly put it, a system crash of epic proportions. The silence that had initially greeted my pronouncements in the chapel quickly erupted into a cacophony of shocked whispers, horrified gasps, and the distinct, if distant, sound of Olivia's hysterical sobs. Julian Vance. I was later informed by a gleeful Thomas, who had lingered for a few moments to observe the fallout, had attempted a hasty, ignominious retreat, only to be cornered by several of my more robust university colleagues, who, having quickly grasped the gist of the situation, seemed intent on having a quiet word with him about the ethics of defrauding a friend. His escape, Thomas reported with considerable relish, had been neither swift nor entirely dignified. My own departure had been more sedate. Thomas drove me back to my apartment, a place that suddenly felt less like a prenuptial bachelor pad and more like a secure, fortified data center, its firewalls now fully restored. The relief I felt was immense, a physical unburdening, as if a massive, corrupted file had finally been purged from my system. There was no triumph, no sense of vengeful satisfaction, only a profound, weary sense of a necessary, if deeply unpleasant, task completed. The legal ramifications, of course, began almost immediately. Olivia, once she had recovered from her initial shock and public humiliation, and presumably after a series of frantic and likely very expensive consultations with a new team of solicitors, her previous ones, I imagined, were now hastily distancing themselves from her and the radioactive fallout of her duplicity, attempted a legal counteroffensive. There were threats of lawsuits for defamation, for breach of promise, an archaic but still occasionally invoked legal concept, for intentional infliction of emotional distress. Alistair Finch, my own calm, implacable solicitor, met each of these threats with a polite but firm presentation of the evidence contained on that small, silver USB drive. The sheer volume and explicitness of Olivia and Julian's correspondence, their detailed plans to defraud me, their contemptuous dismissal of our prenuptial agreement. It was an unassailable fortress of fact. Faced with the prospect of having their entire sordid affair and their criminal conspiracy laid bare in a public courtroom, Olivia's legal team quickly and wisely advised her to retreat. The lawsuits never materialized. The prenuptial agreement, the one they had so arrogantly plotted to dismantle, stood firm, protecting my premarital assets, my intellectual property, my company's shares, the fruits of a lifetime of hard work and innovation. Olivia was left with very little. Her reputation was in tatters. Her carefully cultivated social circle, those who had witnessed her public unmasking, evaporated. Her dreams of effortless affluence, funded by my unwilling generosity, were now just bitter ashes. Last I heard, she had left the city, retreating to some distant, unspecified locale, presumably to lick her wounds and perhaps, if she possessed any capacity for self-reflection, a data point I still considered highly improbable, to contemplate the catastrophic system failure of her own making. Julian Vance, her erstwhile partner in crime, fared even worse. Several of my robust university colleagues had, it turned out, rather significant connections in the financial world, and the story of his attempted fraud and his rather public humiliation circulated with astonishing speed. His reputation as a charming, if somewhat shady, entrepreneur was irrevocably destroyed. His access to other people's money, his primary lifeblood, dried up completely. He, too, reportedly, left the city, his own prospects looking considerably less. Vansion, the wedding gifts, those tangible symbols of a future that would never be, were returned, a task Thomas, with a certain grim satisfaction, undertook on my behalf. The deposits for the lavish honeymoon, the equally lavish reception, the string quartet, those were regrettably non-refundable, a rather expensive lesson in the importance of due diligence before committing to a merger, whether corporate or matrimonial. But it was a price I was willing to pay for my freedom, for the reclamation of my life, for the quiet satisfaction of having exposed a deeply insidious and damaging anomaly in my personal network. My work, my true passion, became my sanctuary in the months that followed. I threw myself into new projects at the financial institution, developing even more sophisticated algorithms for detecting fraud, for identifying hidden patterns of illicit activity, my own recent, painful experience lending a new, sharper edge to my professional endeavors. I became, if possible, even more meticulous, even more relentless in my pursuit of truth within the complex, often murky, datasets I analyzed. Life, I learned, was the ultimate complex system, filled with unforeseen vulnerabilities, hidden malware, and a constant threat of unauthorized intrusion. But it was also capable of remarkable resilience, of self-correction, of purging corrupted files and restoring operational integrity, if one possessed the courage, the skill, and the unwavering commitment to identify and neutralize the threat. The wedding that never was became a cautionary tale, a footnote in my personal history. It did not define me. It did not break me. Instead, it had, in a strange, paradoxical way, liberated me. It had stripped away the last vestiges of a naive trust, a lingering reluctance to confront unpleasant truths, and had replaced them with a harder, clearer, and ultimately more honest understanding of human nature in all its flawed and occasionally downright malicious complexity. The data, as always, had been there all along. I had simply, for a time, chosen to ignore its more disturbing implications. That was a mistake I would not make again. The anomaly had been detected. The system had been secured. And the network, my network, was now stronger and far more resilient than ever before. The years following the wedding that wasn't, as Thomas Drilley referred to it, were a period of quiet, focused rebuilding, not of shattered life, but of a recalibrated one. The dramatic denouement at the chapel had served as a powerful, if painful, system purge, excising the corrupted files of Olivia's deceit and Julian Vance's predatory ambitions from my personal network. What remained was a cleaner, more streamlined, and infinitely more secure operating system. My professional life flourished. The insights gained from my own brush with sophisticated deception lend a new, almost preternatural, acuity to my work in network security and anomaly detection. I developed several groundbreaking algorithms for identifying subtle patterns of financial fraud, algorithms that were adopted not just by my own institution, but by regulatory bodies and law enforcement agencies worldwide. I became a sought-after consultant, a keynote speaker at international cybersecurity conferences, my reputation as a leading expert in the field solidified by a body of work that was both innovative and demonstrably effective. It was a quiet, intellectual satisfaction, a world away from the emotional turbulence of my past relationship with Olivia, and infinitely more rewarding. I never heard directly from Olivia again. Her retreat from the city had been total, her social media presence erased, her connections to our old life severed. Occasionally, a piece of third-hand gossip would filter through. A sighting in a distant, unremarkable town, a rumor of a series of unfulfilling jobs, a life lived in the quiet shadows of her former, glittering ambitions. There was no pleasure in these reports, only a faint, lingering sadness for the waste of potential, for the corrosive power of unchecked greed, and a fundamental lack of integrity. Julian Vance, her partner in duplicity, met a more publicly ignominious end. His name surfaced a few years later in connection with a rather large-scale investment fraud. His modus operandi: charming vulnerable individuals, promising unrealistic returns, then vanishing with their funds, depressingly familiar. He was eventually apprehended, tried, and sentenced to a significant prison term. Justice, it seemed, even in the complex world of white-collar crime, occasionally delivered a clear and unambiguous verdict. The prenuptial agreement, that once contested document, now resided in my secure archives, a testament to the value of foresight and prudent legal counsel. It had done its job, protecting the assets I had worked a lifetime to accumulate from a predatory attack that had been disguised as love. My best man, Thomas, remained a steadfast friend, our bond forged in shared university escapades, and now tempered by the shared experience of navigating this rather extreme personal crisis. We'd often meet for dinner, our conversations ranging from the latest breakthroughs in astrophysics to the enduring complexities of human behavior. He never tired of recounting, with a certain dramatic flair, the look on Julian Vance's face when confronted by my robust university colleagues outside the chapel. It was a small, shared piece of gallows humor that always brought a wry smile to my lips. Life discovered had a way of reasserting its own often surprising patterns. I found a new companionship, a quiet, comfortable relationship with a woman named Dr. Eleanor Ashton. The irony of the shared surname with my ex-fiance's lover was not lost on me. But Eleanor, a respected historian with a keen sense of the absurd, found it rather amusing. She was intelligent, kind, and valued intellectual curiosity and quiet integrity above all else. Our connection was built not on grand romantic gestures or superficial attractions, but on a shared love for knowledge, for reasoned discourse, for the simple, enduring pleasures of a life lived authentically. The wedding that had imploded so spectacularly had, in a strange way, cleared the path for something far more genuine, far more real. It had been a painful, public, and deeply necessary system reboot. The malicious code had been identified and quarantined. The vulnerabilities had been patched. The network, my personal and professional network, was now operating with a new level of security, resilience, and quiet, hard-won wisdom. The data, I reflected, was no longer anomalous. It was at last trending in a decidedly positive and entirely predictable direction. And for a data analyst, there could be no greater satisfaction than a system restored to its optimal and entirely truthful operational state. The quiet rhythm of my life with Eleanor Ashton, my historian companion, not to be confused with the unfortunate surname of Olivia's former paramour, became a source of deep and abiding contentment. Our shared passion for knowledge, for uncovering the narratives hidden within historical records and complex datasets, formed the bedrock of our relationship. We traveled extensively, not to the trendy, C&B-scene destinations Olivia had favored, but to dusty archives, forgotten libraries, and remote archaeological sites, each journey an intellectual adventure, a shared exploration of the past. My work in cybersecurity continued to evolve. The algorithms I developed for anomaly detection became industry standards, and I found myself increasingly called upon to advise governments and international organizations on matters of digital security and the prevention of financial crime. It was demanding work, intellectually stimulating, and imbued with a profound sense of purpose, protecting complex systems from the very kind of insidious, internal corruption I had once experienced so personally. The wedding that never was, the dramatic confrontation at the altar, faded into a distant, almost surreal memory, a cautionary tale I sometimes, in discreet and anonymized terms, shared with younger colleagues as an object lesson in the importance of due diligence, not just in professional matters, but in all aspects of life. Trust, I would tell them, is a precious commodity, easily compromised, and requiring constant vigilance and verification. Olivia and Julian Vance effectively vanished from my sphere of awareness. Their names occasionally surfaced in hushed, almost mythical, whispers among old acquaintances, cautionary figures in a local drama of ambition, betrayal, and spectacular downfall. Their stories served as a stark reminder that facades, however glittering, are ultimately unsustainable if not built on a foundation of integrity. Thomas, my astrophysicist best man, eventually married a wonderful woman, a fellow scientist, and I had the honor of serving as his best man, a role I fulfilled with a quiet, heartfelt sincerity and, I confess, a profound sense of relief that his nuptials proceeded without any unforeseen data breaches. One cool autumn afternoon, many years after the aborted wedding, I was in my study, surrounded by the comfortable clutter of books, research papers, and the gentle hum of my secure servers, when Eleanor came in with a small, rather battered, wooden box. "Alistair," she said, her eyes twinkling, "I was at that little antique fair in Grasmere today. You know, the one with the rather eccentric old gentleman who specializes in obscure scientific instruments? I found this. It reminded me of you." She placed the box on my desk. Inside, nestled on faded velvet, was a beautiful, intricate, 19th century calculating machine, a mechanical marvel of brass cogs, delicate levers, its purpose to perform complex mathematical operations with a precision that, in its day, must have seemed almost magical. It was, I realized, an early analog precursor to the digital algorithms I now worked with, a tangible link between the history of computation and my own life's work. "It's remarkable, Eleanor," I said, genuinely touched by her thoughtfulness, by her deep understanding of the things that truly resonated with me. "It's a beautiful piece of mechanical logic." She smiled. "I thought you might appreciate its inherent integrity. No hidden agendas, no corrupted files. Just pure, honest calculation." Her words, a gentle, loving echo of our shared past and my own personal journey, resonated deeply. The wedding, the betrayal, the public confrontation. These are now just archived data points in a much larger, richer, and ultimately far more satisfying personal history. The true algorithm of my life, I realized, was not one of vulnerability and deceit, but of resilience, of intellectual passion, and of a quiet, enduring love built on a foundation of shared values and unshakable trust. The system, after a catastrophic breach and a comprehensive reboot, was now operating with a level of security, stability, and quiet, joyful efficiency that surpassed all previous metrics. And the data, at last, was entirely and beautifully congruent. The final years of my career were dedicated to establishing an independent foundation focused on promoting ethical practices in data science and cybersecurity. It felt like a natural culmination, a way to channel my professional expertise and personal experiences into something that might contribute to a more secure and transparent digital future. Eleanor was, as always, my staunchest supporter and keenest intellectual sparring partner in this endeavor. Our life together, a harmonious blend of shared intellectual pursuits and quiet domestic contentment, remained the bedrock upon which everything else was built. We often joke that our home was the most secure and yet most open network either of us had ever encountered. The news of Olivia's passing reached me indirectly through a brief, formal notice in an alumni newsletter a couple of years after I had fully retired. She had died relatively young after a short illness in a small, unremarkable town on the coast, far from the glittering social circles she had once so desperately aspired to. There was no mention of Julian Vance, no reference to her former life as Mrs. Alistair Finch to be. Just a stark, simple announcement of a life concluded. I felt a brief, unexpected pang, not of grief, but of a distant, almost abstract sadness. A sadness for the waste of potential, for the choices made, for the happiness that had been so recklessly and ultimately so futilely pursued at the expense of others and ultimately of herself. Her story, in the final analysis, was a cautionary tale, a dataset illustrating the corrosive power of unchecked ambition and a fundamental lack of integrity. Julian Vance, I learned some time later from a colleague still active in financial crime enforcement, had served his prison sentence and had subsequently disappeared into the kind of obscurity that often swallows disgraced con artists once their well of victims runs dry. His legacy was one of ruined lives and shattered trust, a stark counterpoint to the quiet, constructive work I now dedicated my time to. Thomas, my loyal best man, continued to thrive in his field of astrophysics, occasionally calling me with breathless excitement about a new discovery, a new understanding of the vast, complex universe that dwarfed our small human dramas. His friendship remained a constant, a reliable data point in the ever-shifting landscape of life. One afternoon, while sorting through some old files for the Foundation, I came across the silver USB drive, the one I had held aloft in that silent chapel so many years ago. Its contents, the meticulously compiled evidence of Olivia and Julian's deceit, now felt like artifact from a distant, almost forgotten archaeological dig. The raw anger, the sense of betrayal, had long since faded, replaced by a kind of detached, analytical interest in the mechanics of their downfall and a quiet gratitude for my own, hard-won, peace. I considered deleting the files, purging the last remnants of that painful chapter. But then I hesitated. As an analyst, As a custodian of data, I understood the importance of preserving the record, however unpleasant, not as a tool for future retribution, but as a reminder of vulnerabilities identified, of threats neutralized, of lessons learned. A reminder that even the most sophisticated networks, whether digital or human, require constant vigilance, and that the most effective security often lies not in impenetrable firewalls, but in the unwavering commitment to truth, integrity, and the courage to confront anomalies, however unwelcome their initial detection. I placed the USB drive back in its secure, archived location. Its purpose had been served. The system override it had triggered had been a success. The network of my life was now stable, secure, and operating with a quiet, resilient, and entirely authentic integrity. And that, for a man who had dedicated his life to understanding and protecting complex systems, was the most satisfying data point of all. The final audit was complete. The books were balanced, and the future, unburdened by the corrupted files of the past, stretched ahead, clear, open, and filled with the quiet promise of continued, peaceful analysis.